Hello, everyone. Hello, hello. We're just going to give people a couple of minutes to trickle on in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Hello to everyone watching on the live stream on Facebook as well. All right, it's 7:03. Should we go ahead and get started? Why not? Why not? Yeah, I'll answer my own question there. Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to the last installment of Philosophy in the Library of 2021. In fact, the last BPL Presents event of 2021. My name's Ian Olasov. I co-organize this series with Joel Whitney and my partners at the Brooklyn Public Library. I run an organization called Brooklyn Public Philosophers. I'll cut right to the chase. I think I first heard about Candace Delmas's work on civil and uncivil disobedience when I was doing some research about Black Lives Matter and philosophical questions surrounding protest starting in 2017. And sometimes the philosophy that I was reading seemed to somehow be sort of disconnected from the actual practices of protest that people were engaged in, that it didn't seem to have a finger on the pulse of what people are actually doing when they're out in the streets and trying to make change. And so, for a few years now, I've been, intending to get Candace to speak here at the series, and I'm really glad she's able to do this. I think, there's this question of civility and of when disobedience should or shouldn't be civil is something that's really important to people. It came back into public view, I think, during the BLM protests of last summer, but also in a different sort of way during the Capitol riots, and in a sort of ongoing way and sort of general concerns about civility in public discourse. So this is about as timely as it gets, and Candace's work on this is really really excellent. So I'm really pleased she's here to join us. So Candace, take it away.
Thank you so much for this introduction, Ian. And I just want to say hi to everyone, and it's a real pleasure to be with you. Academics don't always talk to what we call the broader public, and I love doing that. So I really look forward to the conversation with you. And let me share this. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to talk to you about the ethics of civil and uncivil disobedience. So in pluralist societies like the ones we live in, we're bound to disagree about matters of shared concern. about matters of justice and more. And such disagreement bears dangers because we can easily take offense, reasonably or not. We might perceive disagreement with our views as a denigration of what we stand for, and by extension of our person. And I think that that's part of why there are these ubiquitous calls for civility, for restraining our conduct and speech in such a way as to display proper respect toward those with whom we disagree. So that's all in the interest of social stability. So civility is supposed to be this glue that keeps us bound together despite our disagreements. And it is for this reason an essential virtue of democratic citizenship, in particular, a disposition to value and foster, because it is conducive to social stability in democracies where we might really disagree strongly and all the time about a lot of important issues. So civility is important, even though it can never fully diffuse the dangers coiled in the fact of disagreement. It's there to kind of smooth things out among ourselves. So what does civility demand? It demands abiding by shared social norms of reciprocity and respect. So rules such as greeting etiquette and formalities of language, whatever society deems essential in the practice of disagreement. And civility also demands abiding by the law, right? So obeying the law, again, in the interest of social stability, because law breaking, no matter its motivation, risks destabilizing society in multiple ways. Well, first, I mean, law breaking may involve violating other people's rights, which the law is set up to protect. But even when disobedience don't violate other people's rights and act in pursuit of justice, their action can destabilize society because it's illegal and it appears anti-democratic. It can have a contagious effect. It can inspire others to do the same, to break the law or to do even worse, right, in terms of noxious effects. But philosophers reflecting on the contemporary activist practices they were witnessing the world over, starting in the 60s, defended the possibility of a special kind of law-breaking, civil disobedience that would not have these deleterious effects on social stability. So civility then can include some forms of civil disobedience, those that abide by the norms of civility, because civil disobedience uniquely can disarm this destabilizing potential. So then the problem for us is that sometimes justice might demand resisting injustice in ways that require not just unlawful, but also non-civil means. So the demands of justice may collide with the demands of democratic citizenship. Think about covertly assisting in the provision of abortion access where it's illegal, or covertly obtaining and leaking classified information showing government abuse of power, or trespassing on nuclear facilities and beating warhead nose cones with hammers. Those are unlawful, non-civil means which the agents engaged in those actions would say are required by justice. So the problem at this point is that we have a disobedient act, which is not civil, and it seems in that way to combine the dangers of uncivil disagreement with the destabilizing potential of civil disobedience, and so to violate the demands of democratic citizenship. So that's what I want to talk to you about today. And I want to suggest that, I want to argue that uncivil disobedience only appears undemocratic and anti-democratic in appearance and not always actually so. So we're going to talk about the possible justification of uncivil disobedience even in liberal democratic societies. So I will first describe and present the standard template of civil disobedience, which is the common sense understanding of civil disobedience that circulates in the public discourse. And then I'll give some important reasons for thinking beyond civil disobedience and conceptualizing uncivil disobedience. And so the second part of the talk will be devoted to the defense of uncivil disobedience. And I'll lay out this defense by responding to two sets of arguments. One set of arguments that are arguments against disobedience in general, such as the ones I just mentioned, against law and order and democracy. And then a set of arguments that say that only civil disobedience is permissible and that and civil disobedience is not. So I'll respond to these. So let's start with the civil disobedience template. And I'm not going to mention many philosophers, but John Rawls, Ronald Dworkin, and Jürgen Habermas, who are presented on the right in the pictures, kind of together along with other Anglo-American political philosophers starting in between the 60s and the 80s, developed this account, which then seeped into the public discourse. And this account was supposed to represent the activist practices they were seeing, they were witnessing. And as you'll see, it doesn't seem to do that very well, but let's not get ahead. So the first thing they did was to contrast civil disobedience with criminal and revolutionary disobedience. So that was important to show that like a society could make room of some kind for civil disobedience, so for a special kind of disobedience. So criminal and revolutionary disobedience is covered, can be violent, the agents attempt to escape punishment, criminal disobedience is self-interested, but civil disobedience is none of these things. Civil disobedience, like revolutionary disobedience, is motivated by moral and political principle, but the key difference is that the civil disobedience and not the criminal and revolutionary agents kind of endorse the overall legitimacy of the system they're acting within. That's the idea. So they conceived of civil disobedience as a conscientious breach of law undertaken to persuade the majority to change a law or policy in a reasonably just, basically legitimate society. And what makes an act of disobedience civil on their view is that it satisfies the following requirements. First, publicity. So the agent of civil disobedience doesn't hide their identity. They act non-anonymously, right? So pre-pandemic times, it even meant you couldn't have like face masks on, like balaclavas. That would be uncivil because you wouldn't take basically responsibility for your action. You're supposed to act in the open, usually meant in a public space, and you should seek to address the community, right? So if you understand civil disobedience as a public argument, then it's key to the legibility of your act as an address, that it be public and visible for all, that it be a kind of speech that you're offering for others to witness, to listen, and to respond to. Central to civil disobedience is, of course, it's nonviolent. So I think that there are three basic elements that are tucked together in nonviolence. And some are properly liberal understanding, especially the first one, the idea that you shouldn't cause injurious harm to persons or property. So you shouldn't use force directed at others and property. And that's very much a neoliberal, classical liberal and neoliberal conception of property as a kind of extension of personhood, which is why it's brought together in this, in the idea of nonviolence. The second element is inherited from the spiritual religious accounts like Tolstoy, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr. offered, the idea that nonviolence means displaying nonviolent self-discipline. So a kind of mastery of the self that is shown outwards, in particular by not resisting violence of the mob or of the police. And third, the idea that because the central task of civil disobedience is to persuade others, you cannot coerce them. It would be incompatible. And so the civil disobedience can't be coercive. Now that's something like a mix between the spiritual and the liberal accounts. But for instance, Gandhi thought that civil disobedience excluded coercion, and King started up that way and then changed his mind about that. So he thought that nonviolence could be coercive. The third element is the willingness to accept punishment, arrest, prosecution, and punishment, and the legal sanction. So accept even inviting those legal sanctions. And then there's a fourth mark that I think one can see in the fact that some acts that present publicity, that display publicity, nonviolence, and non-evasion are not accepted as acts of civil disobedience, things like blasphemous protests that involve storming churches or destroying crosses, and or that seem undignified or offensive, that involve too much expressions of anger. So I think that an important mark of civility is also decorum, the idea that the civil disobedience must act and speak in a dignified, respectable, and respectful manner. Okay, so why does this matter? Because civility demonstrates, so civil disobedience can demonstrate what Rawls called fidelity to law. So the idea that you're acting against the law, but in the spirit of the law, because you're not expressing disrespect for it, you're endorsing the system's legitimacy, and you're addressing your fellow citizens to propose reforming, to propose reform, to propose redressing an injustice. So why should we think beyond civil disobedience? So theorists have created, plenty of philosophers have criticized the standard liberal understanding of civil disobedience that I just outlined, pointing to its narrowness and its demandingness. But I don't think that that's what really matters about it, because for better or for worse, that's just the understanding that circulates in the public discourse. So yes, you might say it's too narrow and we should have a broader understanding of civil disobedience. And a lot of people try to argue that we shouldn't understand civil disobedience that way. But I think that there's a deeper issue that I'm interested in, and that's the ways in which it's selectively applied in exclusionary ways. So the template has been weaponized to police dissent and to deter resistance. So here's an example. On May 29, 2020, Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms declared about the unrest of the previous night, which included burning of police cars and looting. This is not a protest. This is not in the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr. This is chaos. If you care about this city, then go home and pray that somebody like Reverend Beasley will come and talk to you to give you some instructions on what a protest should look like and how you effect change in America. So the definition of civil disobedience is not just a definition, it's an injunction. It's a set of instructions to follow. And it is systematically used to judge, to evaluate contemporary protest movements and to find them wanting, to declare them not on par with that template, that ideal. So of course, so the template of civil disobedience I presented goes hand in hand with the official narrative of the civil rights movement, as you can see from Mayor Bottoms' address. And that official narrative offers a romantic, idealized, historically inaccurate version of the struggle that distorts political reality. So in particular, by ignoring the contributions of radical groups to the struggle, that celebrates submission by always showing those nonviolent activists that were not responding to the blows they were suffering. And in this way, the narrative and the template together function as a kind of counter-resistance ideology to buttress the status quo and police dissidents and deter resistance. So I think that that's why we should think beyond civil disobedience. Okay, So that's the mark I propose. So as I said, like because the template of civil disobedience is widely accepted in the public discourse, I'm not really saying that that needs to change. Others have said that, that's interesting, but I want to talk about uncivil disobedience. So the broadest concept we need is the concept of resistance, which I define as a multidimensional continuum of dissenting acts and practices motivated by moral and or political principles and intended to oppose perceived injustice. And then as a subset of that, so within a subset I won't talk about might be like revolutionary resistance, right? Insurrectionary resistance, which we can talk about in the Q&A. But principled disobedience is the subset I'm interested in, what involves lawbreaking, right? So it's the subset of resistance that involves intentional lawbreaking. And then there are two subsets within that, and one is civil disobedience and the other is uncivil. So civil is the subset that is primarily communicative, right? Remember, it's a public plea, it's an address, and it satisfies the basic norms of civility. And then on the other hand, uncivil disobedience is the subset of principled disobedience that fails to satisfy. And by fail to, I mean not necessarily try. They may try and fail, or they may not even intend to. So that fails to satisfy the basic norms of civility by being either covered or anonymous, violent, injurious to persons, harmful to oneself, destructive of property, or coercive, evasive of law enforcement and legal sanctions, or, you know, in contempt of court and so on, right? So you can think about evasion at all levels of legal sanctions, or offensive, disrespectful, or undignified. And so uncivil disobedience is the term for lots of different things, right? Because it may be that it's uncivil, not because it's violent, but because it's covered and evasive or offensive. So, so the concept of uncivil disobedience doesn't really tell you whether it's justified and how it's going to be justified. There's going to be a lot of things to look at in the context, in the intentions, in the effects. And different types of uncivil disobedience will call for different evaluative lenses, okay? But I'm gonna give you a kind of patchwork of arguments for the justification of uncivil disobedience. And the first, some examples, of course. So the suffragettes smashing the windows of London's shopping districts. This is Earth Liberation Front. They defend eco-sabotage, among other things. So forms of destruction of forestry exploitation machines. Sanctuary assistance, so helping unauthorized migrants. The Sea Shepherd, they were called pirates by a court. They attacked whaling ships in order to save whales from hunting. Edward Snowden, who leaked classified documents about the NSA's surveillance program, massive international and domestic surveillance program. Pussy Riot, they staged a punk prayer in Moscow's Cathedral of Christ the Savior. They were arrested and charged with hooliganism. They're still in prison. This is a 1992 South LA uprising or rioting. The digital disobedience, so hacktivists, here the group Anonymous. They have many different goals, but a lot of them involve transparency. Animal Liberation Front, engaging in covert animal rescue, which is considered an instance of theft. And these are anti-mask, gun-toting protesters that went on to occupy a government building in a state. So lots of different examples. Some of them, most of them, in fact, have been called civil disobedience by those who approve of them. So sympathizer, people who think that those things are justified, try to call these things civil disobedience. And I think that that's a mistake. But I'll explain that you can grant the incivility of disobedience and find arguments to justify them without necessarily just going to the argument that these things are civil disobedience. So how do we defend uncivil disobedience? Like I said, I want to respond to the arguments against it. So disobedience, even civil, but a fortiori uncivil, is impermissible in liberal democratic states, right? That's the starting point. So there are arguments against disobedience in general and arguments against uncivil disobedience in particular. I'm not going to read them here because we're turning to them right away. So the first one is that disobedience violates the moral duty to obey the law. And that's my book, A Duty to Resist. So what I showed in the book is that the same grounds that support the duty to obey, so the natural duty of justice, the principle of fairness, the duty of Samaritanism, which requires rescuing people, and political association, so the associative duties we have among citizens as members of the polity. These four grounds are the most commonly used grounds to argue that we have a moral duty to obey the law. Well, these grounds, under real world conditions where there are structural injustice and other cases of injustice, government wrongdoing, and so on, support obligations to resist injustice. They don't just support a blanket duty to obey the law. So that's the central argument of the book in all the 4 central chapters. And these obligations sometimes require principled disobedience, which may be civil or uncivil. These obligations, importantly, are among our political obligations. So in philosophical parlance, political obligation just means the duty to obey the law. And I think that that concept should be rethought. Political obligation should be a plural thing. We have plenty political obligations, and the weightiest ones are resisting injustice. Disobedience destabilizes the legal order and flouts democracy. So I'm presenting both here briefly. So disobedience destabilizes the legal order. Well, some types of uncivil disobedience, such as government whistleblowing, actually try to do the opposite. They can stabilize society. They try to do that. And the famous ones that we now consider heroes like Daniel Ellsberg here on the left, and also Edward Snowden, really help preserve the rule of law by challenging the government's misuse of power. So Ellsberg was the Pentagon paper and the government's conduct of war crimes in Indochina and lying about it at home. And as I mentioned, Snowden and the domestic surveillance program. They exposed that, they led to reform, and that made society more stable, not less stable. On the side of democracy, the objection is that disobedience flouts democracy. It expresses contempt for democratic decision-making processes, because in disobeying the law, the agent is in effect saying, I know better than the rest of you what justice requires, or what the public good requires. And I don't care about the laws that the rest of you are abiding by. So it's a kind of free riding problem and a failure of mutual reciprocity. And I'll say more about that at the end, actually. But basically, much civil disobedience and much uncivil disobedience really intends to highlight democratic deficits and to fix them. So the suffragettes are, again, a good example, because they just sought the franchise. So they were pointing to the exclusionary structure of society. It excluded women's votes, and they were disobeying uncivilly in order to draw attention to that and seek redress. So an inclusive democratic franchise. I think that hacktivists are also a good example, because much of digital disobedience, especially in the open source software movement, seeks to educate the public about the deficits of democratic governance in the internet. So it wants to democratize and publicize the internet, and to change all the private structure and corporate and government and militarized structures of surveillance that are enabled throughout our experiences and the architecture of the internet. So those are not just responses to the objection, but ways in which you can justify uncivil disobedience. Now I want to turn to the arguments against uncivil disobedience in particular, and that are supposed to say that only civil disobedience is acceptable. And a really important one is the idea that only civil disobedience can be effective, and uncivil disobedience is always going to be counterproductive. And that's the main reason why a social movement should not use it, or agents. So the objection is that a movement that relies on uncivil tactics is doomed to fail because it will fail at the essential task of moral suasion. So the idea that it needs to win potential allies, win them over, melt their hearts and minds, and get them to see the injustice and really want to reform. So the objection is that uncivil disobedience is sure to alienate and turn off potential allies instead of winning them over. And so it will undermine the chances of success. Erika Chenoweth and Maria Stephan are political scientists who have written a book, Why Civil Resistance Works, that provide empirical support for the idea that nonviolent civil resistance is the only thing that works well, reliably, and sometimes almost infallibly. We can talk more about the nature of their data, but they really want to say that an incivility in resistance must be avoided at all costs because of the risks it carries to the movement. Okay, so the response there is that moral suasion, so persuasion or winning over allies, may not be among agents' goals. And that is just basic, right? So I mentioned covertly providing access to abortion where it is illegal. Well, the main goal is not to persuade. You may well be engaged in a movement that seeks to bring reproductive justice rights to everyone. But if you as a doctor or in some other way aid women access abortion where it is not provided, where it is illegal, where it is criminalized, the main goal for you as you do this is just to help that women. The same goes with sanctuary assistance, right? Illegally providing shelter, clothes, or legal assistance to unauthorized migrants. Your main goal there is just not persuasion. Or think again about, helping fugitive slaves reach safety, Canada, and so on, through the Underground Railroad. The main goal is not persuasion, even if you are also engaged in the abolitionist movement and publicly speak about it. So uncivil tactics just do not necessarily alienate the public, sometimes because they're not visible, sometimes because even if they are visible, they just don't have that effect, right? So government whistleblowing doesn't alienate the public when it comes to the government wrongdoing that is being exposed, or members of ACT UP engaged in all kinds of shocking zap tactics that involve some incivility, such as blasphemy or political funerals in which they spread ashes of their dead comrades in pharmaceutical congresses, on buffets and in cocktails and so on, and that was deemed too radical and uncivil. And in fact, ACT UP is now seen as having radically transformed the gay rights movement for the better and really positively influenced the public, even though that was not seen as such at the time. There was also the idea that part of Chenoweth and Stephan research that radical flanks in a movement are bad. And that just doesn't, so the social science is out on that. There is also positive radical flank effect, and it's also really important to see the complementarity of diverse tactics for a given movement. So the Black freedom struggle famously might not have gone the way it did. And I don't want to suggest like it was a complete success by any means, but like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 might not have been come to existence without the threat of Black nationalism. So it's always important to look at the whole picture. There's also one thing I want to point to, which is that it's the second element of nonviolence that I mentioned. So the idea that nonviolence means nonviolent self-discipline, and it's often rendered visible by activists not responding to violence, to blows, to violent arrests, to violent police, or to violent angry mobs. And that means that they shouldn't defend themselves. And Chenoweth and Stephan wrote about the Black Lives Matter protests and other protests that it's best when protesters just don't defend themselves. That's the more tactically efficacious route. I think that warnings like this or demands like this should really give us pause. They equate self-defense with violence, right? So suddenly when you have protesters defending themselves from a violent anti-riot police, deploying tear gas against them or water jets and so on, suddenly the peaceful march is now labeled as violent because some people are defending themselves. There are street medics trying to protect others from injury. And that equation is wrong, and it also obscured the moral justification of the use of self-defense. And in some way, it conceals the very violence that is deployed against them. So I find that particularly problematic when it comes to calls for civility. And finally, I'll note this idea that is that uncivil disobedience is seen as counterproductive. It's widely perceived as such. And in some way, it works as a self-fulfilling prophecy because people might not join a movement that is seen as uncivil because of expressions of anger or and so on, because they'll expect that less people might join it, and not because there's anything inherently wrong in those uncivil tactics. And that means that, yes, probably a movement that resorts to uncivil tactics will be less, will self-police, will self-censor, and might be less able to rally some people if that's what it tries to do. But that strikes me as a kind of added layer of injustice to the injustice that the activists are trying to protest, because it unfairly restricts the repertoire of acceptable tactics. I'll note about that finally that in fact, Black Lives Matter, for instance, which was throughout the summer, so 95% of the protests were nonviolent, but throughout the movement, they were widely condemned for being uncivil in their virulent anti-police chants or because of the instances of property destruction that there was. But in fact, there was an unprecedented participation of the people in those movements. So it didn't have the effect of really turning off potential allies. Okay, the last objection is and it looks a bit like the anti-democratic aspect. It's the idea that uncivil disobedience threatens civic friendship, and civic friendship is understood as that bond that keeps us together as we all have goodwill toward each other and endorse a kind of mutual reciprocity. And any kind of resistance, but especially uncivil disobedience, would be seen as eroding and undermining this civic friendship, as not being forward-looking in like the future of democratic concord that the agent is supposed to want to build towards. So the question is, what if the ties of civic friendship don't extend to everyone? So think about a liberal democratic society which professes its commitment to respecting everyone's full and equal status, but in which some citizens are effectively denied full and equal status, and the injustice of this denial is not publicly recognized. Well, in those cases, the majority may be bound by civic friendship, may feel bound by civic friendship, but for oppressed minorities, it is an illusion. And I want to say that in those cases, civil disobedience might well work. So it will be warranted. It might well be effective, but there could be also a unique role that uncivil disobedience can play here in forcing the community to confront the disconnect between reality and its professed ideals. So the use of uncivil disobedience tactics can effectively highlight the deceptions of civic friendship. It can kind of call civility's bluff, right? It can tell society, stop with all those calls for civilities, because those calls for civility assume an equal standing of all of us that is not present. Through uncivil disobedience, agents can question the rules of public engagement. So who is to speak, where and how, and about what. And they can convey defiance and distrust. And in many cases, that defiance and this distrust may be warranted. And to that extent, it is worth expressing, even if it's going to turn some people off, because apt, fitting expressions of defiance and distrust are important on their own for various audiences, for fellow oppressed, and not just for the majority. So that's the kind of arguments for uncivil disobedience that I wanted to point to. I am done with the PowerPoint. I really look forward to your comments and questions.
Great. Thank you so much. That was a really rich presentation. We've got at least one question in chat for starters. So I'll read that. If people want to use the raise hand function to put themselves in the queue or add other questions in chat, you can do that as well. Ruben writes, I hope you can discuss your view of what consequences should be considered a measured response when civil disobedience leads to physical violence. So, yeah, what's when civil or uncivil disobedience, for that matter, like gets out of hand, what sort of appropriate responses does the state have?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, let me just say something general about the appropriate response usually. So, okay, one, civil disobedience is not a legally recognized category of action, which means that civil disobedience just are not treated as civil disobedience. They're treated as having broken whatever law they broke. So that's important to start. Now, what philosophers and ethicists have called for is, and legal scholars, of course, is a recognition of the special category of civil disobedience as a kind of conduct. And some philosophers like Kimberly Brownlee say, like, look, we already have this apparatus of protection for conscientious objectors. Conscientious objectors are treated as individuals whose moral conscience conflicts with the demands of law, and we understand that those demands are worth respecting, and so we do what we can to accommodate them and not to force them to obey the law if that really conflicts with their conscience. Why don't we have something like this for civil disobedience? Because in fact, civil disobedience is public, disinterested, conscientious, usually harmless, and whereas conscientious objection in all kinds of ways, like, doesn't even have all these good intentions and good effects, right? It's just a kind of private and personal choice, broadly speaking. So there's those calls for treating civil disobedience like the good democratic citizen that they are, and recognizing the important role they can play in society. And indeed, there's a kind of contradiction in the public discourse, because on the one hand, civil disobedience is often celebrated, I would say, especially with hindsight, right? So we rarely celebrate the civil disobedience that's ongoing, but we celebrate the civil disobedience of the civil rights movement, Rosa Parks. My children go to a school called Parks, and we can appreciate that and see that they were really important components of an enhanced, a more just society. So why don't we have that? What would it look like? It would look like at least having available some legal defenses, which currently they don't have, right? So if Snowden comes back, even so, again, like I don't think that it should be thought as a civil disobedience, but civil or uncivil, if he comes back, he will be judged in a way that doesn't allow him to say that he did this because he thinks the public ought to know about the surveillance program. Under the Espionage Act, that wouldn't be a possibility. The same goes with like anti-nuclear and climate justice activists. Like if they can barely, usually it depends on the courts, but they can barely make a statement about why they did what they did. In the United States, the necessity defense, which used to be used by anti-abortion activists and by climate and anti-nuclear activists, is just no longer an option, basically. So there's nothing. So I take it that part of the question is like, how should the state treat civil disobedience? And so that's important. Now, when it comes to civil disobedience that leads to physical violence, first, so civil disobedience, when it's narrowly understood in the way I described in the template, shouldn't directly lead to physical violence because it is nonviolent, right? So if it's nonviolent, I think it can still be bad. So I think that there's a lot of anti-mask, anti-vaccine, anti-lockdown protests that were civil, but I think that they're not harmless because they're flouting the interest that others have in having a community that's masked and vaccinated for the sake of the most vulnerable among us. And so I don't think that civil disobedience is necessarily harmless. Civil disobedience leading to physical violence, I want to ask the question, like, what does that mean, right? Because often it's police through their policing of peaceful protests, creating violence and creating an escalation of violence with self-defense and then destruction of property and so on. So the question really is like, how did the violence come about? How did people get hurt in the process of protesting or engaging in an act of lawbreaking? It may be that the agents intended a completely nonviolent action, but took risks and then found themselves kind of having to do something they didn't mean to and defending themselves by harming someone else, right? So there's lots of questions here. But the last thing I'll say is I'm not saying that people who get physical violence when it means injury to persons, right? So I said like, we shouldn't think that there's a moral equivalence between violence against persons and violence against property. But let's say if people are injured, then that should be dealt with and by the law. And it may be that the fact that it was principled, that there were moral and political principles behind the action matters, like it does in other contexts, right? But yeah, I'm not saying that there should be no repercussions when people get hurt, when innocent people get hurt. I hope that was helpful, but it's an important question.
Great, thank you. Jane writes in chat, how does one engage in civil disobedience in a society where the other side is openly and dangerously armed with deadly arms and has a law enforcement force that is largely racist, as in today's America? For example, how do you engage in civil disobedience against unjust voting laws in Republican states?
Yes, so that's why I wanted to address the calls for civility that imply not defending yourself. because protesters need to defend themselves from police, and they need to defend themselves from counter protesters that may be armed. Or, in Charlottesville, it's the counter protesters themselves were protesting the Unite the Right rally, where a lot of people were armed. And so there you had Antifa coming and protecting the counter protesters. And it's a tragic context that is just ripe for unplanned violence. So what I think about that in the background is first that those calls for civility and reciprocity are hard to take seriously and in good faith, given the gun culture of the United States, given how law enforcement is militarized and respond to peaceful protests in militarized ways with anti-riot police and much violence. And then also with all the oath keepers and so on, all the insurrectionist violent elements who see the protection of their individual freedom as mainly about their right to bear arms and the Second Amendment. So in this context, civil disobedience is very dangerous and it's not necessarily effective, and which is part of why I want to talk about uncivil disobedience, but I'm not calling for an escalation of violence. I just think that we need to be more aware of the context in which those disobedient actions take place. It's also, of course, important to note that even when agents, protesters engage in civil, completely peaceful protest, they may be just labeled uncivil. Again, like the idea that not defending yourself from violence make you a violent protester is should be really just called out and critiqued. So the context is terrible. So voting laws in Republican states, there needs to be, I think that what it calls for is like a lot. I don't have the answer, right? But what I was going to say is we also need like series of grassroots organizing, which I'm not talking about here when it comes to like the disobedience, right? So disobedience is usually the tail end of a really long process that involves getting together, organizing, deliberating, doing a lot of legal action, legal petitioning and legal lobbying and representation and so on. And disobedience is really just the tip of the iceberg, right? Under Jim Crow, what the very armed white population and deployment of racist violence by the Ku Klux Klan meant was that a lot of people were harming themselves to defend themselves from that violence, right? And so it's a kind of vigilantism against vigilantism. And I don't see the problem in calling them both that, but we need to see the difference. There's the white vigilantism that involves supporting a certain racial and social hierarchical order through terror. And then there's the black vigilantism that involves defending oneself and the community in a context where they're under attack by white armed vigilantes and where the state tolerates, if not encourages, that kind of racist violence. And when, as in tolerates and encourages, as in they do not seek the perpetrators. Many police are part of the Ku Klux Klan. And when there is a trial, the perpetrators get scot-free. So these are not to be put on par, right? But like, well, arms call for armed defense. And that is the tragedy of the gun culture in America.
Great, thank you. Imran writes in chat, are there markers by which you think the state could distinguish revolutionary disobedience from uncivil disobedience that seeks to rehabilitate rather than erode the civil state broadly? So it's sort of like reform versus revolution type question. Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't have a good answer here, but that's what I'm thinking about now in my I guess future research with the ethics of insurrection and revolution and not uncivil disobedience. So in my conceptualization of uncivil disobedience, the part of the point of the concept is to highlight the illegality and the incivility, where a lot of people would just want to call a lot of things that I call uncivil disobedience, civil disobedience, just because they approve of it. And I think that, so there is a bit of political violence in uncivil disobedience, but the most straightforward one that I'm happy comprising in the concept is the destruction, the targeted destruction of property. When political violence is of more of a greater scope and scale and with maximalist goals, then it just doesn't make sense to talk about uncivil disobedience, and we should be talking about insurrectionary or revolutionary resistance or disobedience. The difference between insurrection and revolution is usually in scope. So you can have an insurrection against a government, against even a slave plantation, right, under in the antebellum South. And the revolution is really seeks the overthrow of the entire system and upending of the hierarchies. So you could have uncivil disobedience that really seeks to be something insurrectionary and the insurrection seeking to become revolutionary and failing or not at any stage. And the markers, like I said, it would be a kind of gradation in the scale and scope and aims of the violence, but certainly and terrorism might also be in there, right? So that's for the conceptualization. For the you ask about the rehabilitating rather than eroding the civil state. Those are really the important question here, right? With uprisings, with insurrections, and with revolution, and so for instance, the January 6th Capitol assault, I think, is somewhere between a domestic terror attack that was the plan, and like, right, there were the bombs and the attempt at kidnapping and so on. And it was insurrectionary and possibly revolutionary, but the goal was really to keep President Trump in power and keep the status quo. And so in the process, there was an erosion of democratic institutions and democratic norms, because the goal wasn't to highlight democratic deficits or enhance justice. It was to keep in power a president that had been voted out of power, and in so doing, to keep a certain racial order, social order in place undisturbed. You, of course, have in history a lot of examples of insurrectionary and revolutionary disobedience that seek to rehabilitate or recreate or reenact a form of democratic sovereignty that would be one that create a new normative order for everyone to abide by. And those are, revolutionary constituting moments of history: the Haitian Revolution, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, in some ways too, and so I think that we need to think about like insurrections that are so slightly lesser, that have a slightly less ambitious scope than a revolution, but that do try to present a kind of new social contract, a new constituting of the demos, right? The people that constitute the polity. So those are the questions there that matter, much more so than the tactics, I want to say, right? So storming a government building is something that is going to be a part of uncivil disobedience, justified or unjustified, insurrection that's justified or not, and a revolution. And it's like, it's not the storming of the building that we necessarily need to focus on, but it's really about the harms that are perpetrated, but the goals that are pursued and the values that are promoted.
Great, thank you. Sarah writes in chat, as you listed, vaccine refusers and anti-maskers could be seen as people currently engaged in civil disobedience. They're standing for the principles of bodily autonomy and limitations of the state. But their disobedience is based on a falsity that vaccines and masks are an illusion. Isn't there some sort of factual basis that has to be part of the criteria for respectful acknowledgement of civil disobedience? I mean, I'll just indulge myself here because I was thinking of a similar question that, like, you know, the definition of civil disobedience is sort of content neutral. It does not, it doesn't specify what the disobedience is about. And so it seems like weird to try to say whether a protest is like permissible or impermissible without talking about what the protest is for or against. But is there any room for sort of like procedural or like content neutral ways of thinking about the ethical questions here, or is that just like a mistake from the start?
No, I think you're both right. So I think that civil disobedience, as the value neutral concept of civil disobedience, matters because in some ways it shows that and how much of it can be tolerated. So I think that's the question with civil disobedience. It's like, can civil disobedience tolerate civil disobedience, or do they have to like throw everyone in jail and be really and harshly prosecute them? And I think that a value neutral concept is useful there to say that there is that liberal democratic societies, if they're serious about their liberal commitments, have to accept like the expression of really objectionable views. And indeed they do, right? I mean, the US does so much more than other liberal democratic societies because it doesn't even criminalize hate speech. But there is the possibility of expressing in civil ways, so non-violently, publicly, and so on, your objectionable views. Now, that does, again, that saying that it's tolerable doesn't mean it's justifiable or permissible. So the permissibility here hinges on like, do you mean it's tolerable or do you mean it's justified? So I want to say that it could be tolerated without being justified. And just to be clear, so some of the anti-vax, anti-mask, anti-lockdown protests were not civil, right? But I don't think that the civil disobedient ones are completely out of bounds in society. I just think they were profoundly wrong and unjustified. And part of what made them unjustified were the deleterious effects in the community and the spread of misinformation and so on. And so how do you judge whether a protest is justified or not? You look at the cause in part, and you look at the reasoning that led them to supporting a particular kind of goal. And for anti-lockdown, anti-vax, anti-mask protesters, it's falsehoods. So is it for Stop the Steal? It's complete falsehood. So they're not warranted in their belief. So it's not even the kind of disagreement that democracies should be able to have reasonable disagreements about, because this is not a reasonable disagreement. This is some people who are whose beliefs are based on false information, falsehoods that are really harmful for society. So it's really important for the justification of it and the lack thereof, and that's what we need to bring attention to. not so much the fact that they were out talking about it, I guess. But yeah, so some people, so Trump allies and so on, I'd call the anti-lockdown protesters modern day Rosa Parks. And other people, scholars and commentators, pundits, were saying, well, no, it's not even a case of civil disobedience because it didn't promote social norms of solidarity, justice, and inclusion. And so that's why it was not even civil disobedience. And that's where I think the debate is misguided. So not all civil disobedience are modern day Rosa Parks, because not all civil disobedience is justified. And I think that a more or less value neutral concept of civil disobedience is not that bad. But the reason why sympathizers keep calling protests that don't seem to satisfy the marks of civil disobedience is because it seems that once you called something civil disobedience, you also justified it. And I think that the identification or the definition and the justification should be kept separately, that it doesn't do much good to bring it all together. Otherwise, we're always just talking about whether so-and-so really engaged in civil disobedience or not, and that's not helpful. And then you end up saying like, oh, the anti-maskers are not civil because they're really acting selfishly and on the basis of false information. So that's my view on like the framing of the debate. But yeah, the fact that they, because of course they can say like, well, they're defending their bodily integrity, and you could be an anti-vaxxer without being fed completely false information, just saying I don't want to vaccinate my children and so on. I mean, there's room for some kinds of reasonable disagreement about some of it, of course. And there's plenty of people from both sides, from left and right in Europe and so on, who are taking it's very polarized in the United States in ways that it's not drawn along the same political rifts in the rest of Europe.
Great, thanks. I'll plug the philosopher Maya Goldenberg's Vaccine Hesitancy book, which is really just an excellent source on this.
Great.
I think we have time for one more question. So this is from Bridget. Thank you so much for the brilliant presentation. I wonder how you might hypothetically speak up as a virtual audience member and employee of a higher ed institution in a liberal state when a guest speaker at the university's virtual fireside chat, the Ariana Huffington, the media person, says she supports the BLM protests and in the same breath prescribes that they must be peaceful as of summer 2020. So it's a similar sort of thing to the Atlanta mayor quote that you had in the presentation. I'm still struggling on how she could have been challenged succinctly, as I was taken aback at that moment. Thank you. Yeah, like any guidance for like, how do you like rhetorically like respond to people who make these sort of extraordinary demands of protesters in the moment?
Yeah, well, I didn't do it very succinctly. So, so the rhetorical question back would be like, do you mean they should peacefully submit to the violence that is inflicted on them by the police? Like, is that the peaceful you're calling for? There's that question that I think is a really important question, because it was a lot of what was going on. Chenoweth and Stefan were asking for that. We're saying that defending oneself from violence, even if it is morally justified, is tactically counterproductive and so shouldn't be used. And so that's part of what the calls for civility imply, like not defending yourself, not helping others. And so, throwing back tear gas canisters, using homemade shields. So you show up with a homemade shield and you're Antifa. You have milk to protect from the to protect from the effect of the tear gas in eyes and so on, and you now look like again an Antifa protester, or you have goggles and so on. And a lot of the Black Lives, again, I'm not succinct here, but sorry, the Black Lives Matter activists were using tactics from the Hong Kong pro-democracy protests, who were also not, so we used all kinds of really ingenious, inventive crowdsourcing tactics and so on, and we're constantly in the business of defending protesters from the violent police that was attacking them. So yes, they must be peaceful. What does that mean? Not defending yourself when it is morally justified to do so from an incredible amount of violence unleashed at them. And then the peacefulness also meant like stop being angry. And I think that that's something that we also need to rethink, like expressions of anger are warranted and fitting in a context where society professes that everybody is a full and equal member of the status of society, but does not treat everyone as a full and equal member worthy of concern and care. So that's part of the, and really, I mean, they were mostly peaceful anyway. All of the violence was traced back to counter protesters and to police. So I feel, so I spent 2020 defending uncivil disobedience, but I was often conflicted about it because they were really mostly peaceful. It's just that they kept being called uncivil, and I was defending the uncivil disobedience parts of it, but it was mostly civil. But there's something interesting about Black Lives Matter is I do think that they intentionally departed from the civil disobedience template that I was describing, and what, you know, Mayor Keisha Lance Bottom talked like what a protest should look like. And a part of the motto, especially in the earlier instantiation of Black Lives Matter in 2015, was not your civil rights movement. Sorry, not your grandfather's civil rights movement. So a kind of intentional deviation from the politics of respectability that were associated with the civil rights movement, and a full embrace of the kind of defiance and rage that fueled this latest movement.
Great, thank you so much. I think we should call it here. I think an hour and 15 minutes is most people's limit for a Zoom event. This was really great. People can go check out your book or check out your full Phil Compass article. There's a lot of good stuff that you've written about this. If people are interested in finding out about future Philosophy in the Library events, they can check out Brooklyn Public Philosophers on Facebook. They can check out BPL Presents. We've got all sorts of stuff coming up in the future, although of course with the pandemic, things are still slightly up in the air. But again, thank you all so much for coming, and Candace, thanks for the talk.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you everyone for coming. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I wish you all happy holidays.